Preston Trucking ran freight for Anheuser-Busch, Rubbermaid, and Hoover out of more than 60 terminals in 21 states. It was one of the 25 largest trucking companies in America. It was so good to its employees that it earned a chapter in a national bestseller about the greatest places to work in the country. A year before it died, Preston had paid off every dollar of its debt. Then, in 1 week in July 1999, every truck stopped, every terminal went dark, and 5,500 people lost their jobs with no warning. Deregulation gets blamed. Not wrong, just too small. Here's the part that gets skipped in the tidy version of this story. Preston didn't fold because trucking got deregulated in 1980. Deregulation hit every trucking company in America at the same moment, and Preston didn't just survive it. For years, it thrived on it. If deregulation alone killed companies like this, Preston should have died in the 80s. Instead, it took 19 more years. And in its final 12 months, this company had just done something almost no unionized freight carrier its size could claim. It had paid off every dollar it owed. So the real explanation isn't hiding in 1999. It's hiding in a much smaller, much older story in a town most people have never heard of. Preston, Maryland is barely a dot on a map of the eastern shore of Chesapeake Bay. In 1932, it was not home to a trucking company at all. It was home to a canned goods wholesaler that had a very ordinary problem. Shipping small, irregular loads by rail was slow and unreliable, and an accountant working there named A.T. Blades had an idea. Instead of fighting the railroads for scraps of capacity, why not just build a small trucking operation and move the freight themselves? Blades borrowed $500 from his employer to get it started. Not a visionary with a master plan. An accountant solving a shipping headache with a loan he probably thought he would quietly pay back and forget. He ran the company for the next 50 years. By the mid-1930s, employees had given the operation a nickname that stuck for the rest of its life, the 151 line. Not because it sounded impressive, because someone counted the tractors and trailers the company owned, and the number came out to 151, a truck count, not a slogan. That tells you exactly what kind of company this was going to become, one built on counting what it actually had and being honest about it. Here's where most tellings of this story get the emphasis wrong. People assume this is a trucking industry story about regulation, deregulation, routes, and rates. It's not really. Preston's defining trait wasn't its freight network. It was how it treated the people who ran that network. And that ended up mattering more to its survival than any route map. To understand why that's strange, you need to picture what trucking actually looked like before 1980. For nearly 50 years, this was a slow, sleepy, heavily protected industry. The federal government decided who could haul freight, on which routes, at what rates, almost like a public utility. If you had a route, it was yours, and nobody could legally show up and steal it out from under you by charging less. That protection made trucking predictable in a way almost no other American industry was. Preston grew up entirely inside that predictability for nearly 5 decades. Then, in 1978, cracks showed up in Preston's own operation before the industry even changed. Workers in Detroit staged a wildcat strike. Management responded with a 3-week lockout that idled 2/3 of the workforce there. It was ugly enough that Preston brought in outside consultants to figure out what was actually broken between management and labor. What came out of that crisis is what made Preston famous. Employees were renamed associates. Supervisors became coordinators. In 1983, Preston rolled out the trucking industry's first worker-voted productivity bonus system. 3 years later, it won a United States Senate Productivity Award. By 1988, it had earned a chapter in a best-selling book about the best companies to work for in the country. This is the part that matters. Preston wasn't just a freight company that happened to treat people well. Being loyal to its workforce was the actual product. That loyalty That refusal to treat labor as disposable is the thread that runs all the way to the end of this story. In 1980, the rules Preston had grown up inside disappeared overnight. The Motor Carrier Act deregulated American trucking, tearing down the fixed routes and rates that had protected companies like Preston for half a century. Suddenly, any carrier could invade any territory and undercut on price. For dozens of legacy trucking companies, that single law turned out to be a slow death sentence. Preston wasn't one of them. Not at first. Not for a long time. The same year deregulation hit, Preston posted a profit of just over $5 million. 2 years later, by 1982, the company had crossed $200 million in revenue and ranked as the 9th largest trucking company in America by profit. This was Preston's 50th anniversary year, and by every visible measure, it looked like proof that the loyalty model actually worked, that you could run a unionized, employee-first freight company and still win in a suddenly cutthroat market. That got attention, and not just from other truckers. Industry researchers studied Preston's productivity system. A national business magazine profiled its labor model in print. For most of the 1980s, Preston looked less like a company clinging to survival and more like a company that had cracked a code nobody else had. Employees genuinely believed in the productivity system. Customers like Anheuser-Busch, Rubbermaid, and Hoover kept their freight with Preston because the service was reliable. For about a decade, this company looked like living proof that loyalty and stability still worked in a deregulated world that was supposedly rewarding the opposite. That belief was about to get tested. While Preston celebrated productivity awards, the rest of the industry was quietly reorganizing around a colder logic. Deregulation had opened the door to a new kind of competitor, leaner, non-union regional carriers who didn't carry Preston's labor costs. They could enter a market, undercut on price, and exit again without the same fixed obligations written into every one of Preston's union contracts, no decades-deep pension commitments, no negotiated wage scales locked in years in advance. They could move like water. Preston, by design, could not. At the same time, Preston's old guard peers, the other unionized giants that had grown up in the same regulated world, were dying around it. Roadway, Carolina Freight, Consolidated Freightways, which would eventually collapse into its own bankruptcy in 2002. These weren't Preston's imitators. They were proof that the entire structure Preston belonged to, union wages, legacy costs, a business built for a protected market, was becoming harder to sustain across the board, even for companies that looked strong on the surface. And there's a twist, buried in Preston's own corporate family. In 1987, Preston made an acquisition that would eventually connect it to one of its most painful ironies, a sibling company that would go on to survive and thrive long after Preston itself was gone. That deal is the moment this story actually turns. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They assume Preston's story really starts falling apart in 1999. It doesn't. It starts 12 years earlier, in January 1987, with a single acquisition. Preston bought a company called Saia Motor Freight Line for $62 million. On paper, it looked like the kind of expansion a confident company makes. Underneath, it did something Preston had never done in its entire 55-year history. It put the company into debt. Preston had operated debt-free for over half a century, through mergers, through deregulation, without ever needing to borrow heavily against its own future. The Saia deal changed that in a single transaction. Debt doesn't announce itself as dangerous the moment you take it on. It just sits there, quietly reducing how much room you have to survive the next bad year. Preston didn't have to wait long to find out how little room that actually left. Starting in 1990, the company posted 3 straight years of losses, nearly $19 million in the red in 1990 alone. A recession hit at exactly the moment Preston had the least financial cushion in its history. A debt-free Preston might have absorbed that recession the way it had absorbed deregulation a decade earlier. A Preston carrying Saia's acquisition debt could not. That sounds like a footnote. It isn't. Everything that happens for the rest of this story, the rescue that comes next, the ownership change after that, the final phone call in 1999, is downstream of one acquisition made in a single month in 1987, when a debt-free company decided it could afford to stop being debt-free. By 1992, 3 consecutive years of losses had pushed Preston to the edge, and the company agreed to be acquired rather than risk bankruptcy on its own. In 1993, Yellow Corporation, one of the giants Preston had once out-hustled, bought Preston for roughly $24 million, plus more than $100 million in assumed debt. It was framed as a rescue, in the sense that it kept the trucks moving, it was. But look at what happened once Preston became a subsidiary. According to Yellow's own financial filings, Preston ran an operating ratio above 100 in both 1995 and 1996, meaning, in plain terms, it was spending more to run its operations than it was bringing in. It was losing money quietly, inside a parent, large enough to absorb those losses without anyone outside noticing. Preston hadn't been fixed. It had been hidden. Then, in the summer of 1998, something happened that looked from the outside like redemption. 3 of Preston's own executives bought the company back from Yellow in a management buyout. As part of the deal, Yellow forgave roughly $80 million in debt. Preston was declared debt-free again for the second time in this story, with local ownership and a 5-year labor agreement already secured with the Teamsters. Here's the part that should stop you. That's the exact company from the opening of this video, the one that had just paid off every dollar of its debt a year before it died. Except the buyout created new damage almost immediately. Customers who relied on Preston's stability didn't know what to make of an ownership change layered on top of ongoing labor negotiations, and enough of them hedged their bets by shifting freight elsewhere that it showed up directly in the numbers. According to a memo later written by Chief Executive Officer David Letke, Preston's revenue dropped 12% in 1998, more than $200,000 a day, tied directly to customer uncertainty over the sale. That's not an abstract market shift. That's customers, one by one, quietly deciding Preston might not be a safe bet before anyone actually knew whether it was. None of this had to be fatal alone. A 12% revenue drop is a serious wound, not an automatic death sentence for a company that had just wiped its debt clean. But it meant Preston entered 1999 with almost no cushion left at the exact moment it needed one most. The company's working capital came from a lender called Congress Financial Corporation, financing secured against Preston's receivables and equipment. Through the first half of 1999, that held. Then, on a single Saturday, July 24th, Preston's leadership was told its lenders would not make any additional advances. According to the company's own chief financial officer, that message left Preston without the cash it needed to keep operating. Not a slow decline. A single phone call on a single day that a company with real cushion might have survived, and a company that had just spent 12 years bouncing between debt and debt-free could not. Stack it up. A debt-taking acquisition in 1987, recession losses with no cushion left. A rescue that quietly hid ongoing losses instead of fixing them. A buyout that restored the balance sheet on paper while spooking the customers who mattered. A revenue collapse that ate the cushion that buyout was supposed to create. And one lender's decision on one Saturday that finally had nothing left to absorb it. Any single layer, Preston probably survives. All 6 stacked across 12 years, and there was no floor left to catch it. What happened next moved fast, and it moved physically. 2 days after that Saturday phone call, on July 26, 1999, Preston ceased operations. Not began winding down. Ceased. Terminals across 21 states stopped taking new freight that same week. Whatever loads were already in the system got delivered. Nothing new came in behind them. Some drivers found competing carriers already circling the same parking lots, recruiting. 4 days later, on July 30th, Preston filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in federal court in Maryland. It's worth being precise here because bankruptcy, protection, and liquidation get confused all the time. Chapter 11 is technically a request for breathing room, a chance to reorganize debts and keep operating while working out a plan. For Preston, that breathing room never turned into a recovery. It became instead the legal process for winding the company down for good. The liquidation was enormous. Preston's trucks and trailers were sold off across 14 separate equipment auctions. 41 parcels of real estate across 15 states were eventually sold in a single transaction worth roughly $68 million. Nearly 10,000 creditors filed claims against a company whose assets were valued around $156 million against about $92.5 million in liabilities. One detail captures the whole story better than any number. Yellow had built a large terminal in Ohio specifically for Preston's operations, while Preston was still its subsidiary. Within about a month of Preston's collapse, that property reverted back to Yellow's own name. The building never really left the family that had once rescued, then absorbed, then outlived the company it was built for. You have to separate two things that get confused in stories like this: a brand surviving and a system surviving. Preston's name didn't get erased from history. Its 1987 acquisition, Saya, kept operating inside Yellow, was later spun off as its own public company, and by 2025 was reporting more than $3 billion in annual revenue. The debt that helped sink Preston became, in a different corporate shell, one of the biggest success stories left standing in American freight. That's not redemption. That's a company's own former subsidiary outliving it by decades, while the actual network Preston built, the terminals, the routes, the trucks running the 151 line, simply stopped existing in the span of a single week. None of that captures what it felt like on the ground. Ed Oldenburg had worked at Preston's yard in Glen Burnie for about 10 years. He had planned to retire there. Instead, he told reporters there had been no warning, that it had been a shock to everyone at the yard, and that he was afraid to punch in for what might be his last shifts because he did not know if he would get paid for them. Preston's own customers were caught just as flat-footed. Sharon Smith, whose business shipped through Preston, told reporters it was a complete surprise that there had been no warning of any kind. A refund on an unshipped load is not the same thing as a functioning supply chain, and for a business that had built its shipping schedule around Preston's reliability, that gap did not close overnight. And then there's the kind of consequence that does not show up in a court filing at all. A 33-year Preston employee named Diane Engel put it about as plainly as anyone could. When Preston closed, she said, it felt like a family member had died. Former employees still hold reunions through the local historical society in the small Maryland town where this whole story started. Even the legal aftermath had its own quiet cruelty. Laid off workers were owed wages and settlements through the bankruptcy process, and some of those unpaid claims were later bought up by an outside investment firm for roughly 35 cents on every dollar those workers were actually owed. That's what getting your money back looked like for people this company had spent decades telling the world it valued above almost everything else. Step back from the dates and numbers, and Preston's collapse stops looking like an isolated business failure. It starts looking like a pattern. A company built its entire identity around loyalty to its workers, to a model that treated people as partners instead of costs. For decades, that loyalty was a genuine strength. It is the reason Preston beat deregulation instead of being crushed by it, the reason it earned productivity awards in a book chapter while its unionized peers quietly died off around it. But loyalty has a cost, and in a deregulated market that rewards whoever operates cheapest, that cost eventually has to be paid by somebody. Preston paid it in the form of a debt-taking acquisition it could not fully absorb, a labor structure it never abandoned, even as non-union rivals undercut it, and a margin for error that kept shrinking every time the company fixed one problem and created another. That's the real version of it worked until it did not. Not a company that failed to adapt. A company whose greatest strength was also, structurally, the one thing it could never afford to protect forever. If you ever saw one of Preston's trucks running a route through the mid-Atlantic, or worked a shift out of one of those 60-some terminals, or shipped freight through the 151 line, or knew someone who did, say so in the comments. What terminal? What year? What route? Companies like this one do not leave much behind once the trucks stop running. And at this point, the comment section is close to the only place their story still gets told out loud. Picture the yard the way it looked in 1998, the year Preston declared itself free of debt for the second and last time, full of trucks, dispatch boards, covered in routes, a company that genuinely believed it had just secured its future. Now picture that same kind of yard, empty, no trucks, no dispatch board, just a small metal 151 logo sitting in a glass case in a local historical society in the same small Maryland town where an accountant once borrowed $500 to solve a shipping problem. That's the only place the line still runs.